Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here with me tonight. I appreciate you coming out and finding the location and having interest. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. Some of it might be sort of surprising or unexpected to you because as I'm thinking about what's going on as a parent and as an educator, it's led me to really think pretty broadly about what is going on in the world, what are the patterns and systems that are taking shape, and what sort of world are our children being born into, and wanting to encourage others to really be thinking as much as possible about what the implications are about how we got to where we're at and sort of where we're going. So the sort of background question is, what is the water in which we swim, right? What are the things that we take for granted that we don't necessarily see or think about all the time? What is our understanding of the world? What are the sort of background assumptions we have about the world? And what understanding about the world are we transmitting to our children, both explicitly and implicitly, right? So sort of taking a backward step to really think about what is this world that we're bringing our children into and how is it changing? So to start with, there's a lot of problems in the world, right? We seem to be having sort of a hard time figuring out how to live peacefully and equitably and sustainably on a finite planet. We face a lot of what are called wicked problems, right? Problems that are multidimensional, have multiple stakeholders, multiple causes, hard to get a grapple on, always changing. We can see an alarming lack of leadership in the political sphere in terms of really dealing soberly and wholeheartedly and thoughtfully with the immense problems that we face as a human species. So if we really think about what's behind all this, it's important to think about broader shifts that are happening, right? Like the shift from being part of an industrial economy and nation states that have national sovereignty to really moving to an information economy and a really globally interdependent world. So that's one of the bigger shifts that's happening that we need to think about. But also we need to think about how our problems are not just out there in the world, but actually they are us, right? Like our thinking, our way of approaching the problems of the world is really the problem. So the more we understand about our own thinking and the different choices we have available to us in terms of our values, our thought patterns, our logical ways of approaching these problems, the better off we will be. Because one of the main points I want to make is that the complexity of the world requires an increase in competence, right? And one of the issues we're facing is that the external world is changing so rapidly and getting increasingly complex, and the problems are getting more and more multidimensional and interdependent, but human consciousness, human thinking, human competence isn't really keeping pace with that complexity. So we need to think about how we can sort of help ourselves be ready to solve global problems and make it so that it's a world that we even want our children to come into. And the background question that I ultimately want to get to is how are we preparing our children to actually be the solvers of complex problems? So just, many examples of things that are going in dangerous directions, right? Exponential growth curves cannot continue indefinitely. If you look at socioeconomic trends around population, around energy use, around the production and use of certain materials, if you look at things related to climate change, we can see that the direction that things are headed cannot keep going that way. There is some many people feel like there are some inevitable crashes ahead of us, and we need to come to terms with that in some way. And behind a lot of this, it's important to see that part of what we're dealing with is a real misalignment between what we say our values are and then what is actually being reinforced by our behavior, right? So for instance, GDP is a great example. We act like GDP is this important thing, and if it goes up, that's somehow good. And yet oil spills, wars, and natural disasters all increase GDP, right? So we have perverse incentives to actually keep this sort of system going and to keep the numbers looking good, but it's all heading in a direction that is really overwhelming when we stop and think about what the consequences can be. And when we look at something like overall GDP, it's going up over time, but it's completely masking inequality within societies. And it's completely masking the disconnect between the trends that are happening economically and the trends that are happening biologically in the terms of the biosphere and the planet. So when we think about what's happening with the Earth, we're actually thinking of this as a new age. It's called the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene, right? We're actually in a new geological age because humans have had such a big impact on the Earth. And the numbers are just really, really getting out of hand. So we have to find a way to reckon with this, and we have to find a way to do it thoughtfully and in a way that's not overwhelming our children, but actually giving them the tools to start to address some of these issues, because they're global problems, so we need to find a way to come together and have global solutions. And it's interesting because when we think about the world, I think a lot of people today are feeling a dissonance, right? Because we feel like we've made so much progress, and at the same time we feel like everything has to change, right? And part of my intention with this talk tonight is just find ways to kind of grapple with the dissonance that a lot of people are feeling. It's like, on one hand, we have people saying that things are getting better and better and better, and on the other hand, some people are really pessimistic and cynical and feel like everything's falling apart. And part of what I want to do tonight is provide a framework for understanding how we got ourselves in the mess that we're in, but why all hope is not lost, and why there actually is a directionality that is positive for us and our children. But ultimately, in order for that to happen, we need to reckon with reality, and we need to reorient ourselves and adjust our sense-making so that we can make sense of what can be really complicated problems. Because as the saying goes, if we don't change direction soon, we're going to end up where we're going, right? So, with that in mind, part of my orientation too, as I'm thinking about parenting and education, it's not just about how things are right now, but really thinking about the future and how rapidly things are changing, right? So for instance, just looking at media and the huge transition that's taken place from sort of broadcast television type media, where there's a really mainstream narrative that's being propagated to lots and lots of people, sort of getting them on board with a certain ideology. And now we have a totally decentralized interactive digital media, right? And it's hard to even control the narrative. And there's lots of little bubbles and little subcultures and little sub-worlds, sub-realities, sub-narratives about what is going on in the world. And in some ways, that's really scary and dangerous. And we see some negative trends coming out of that. But also, there's a lot of possibility in that too, right? And there's a lot of actually liberation of information that way. So we need to find a way to channel that somehow, because it's happening and it's getting kind of out of our hands. So what kind of thinking is going in to actually ensuring that these new technological innovations are going to be positive, right? So one helpful framework, I think, is this notion of the fourth industrial revolution. So if you think of the first industrial revolution was in the 18th, 19th century, the invention of the steam engine and textiles and factories, and how that totally transformed the planet, right? We can think of the second industrial revolution as happening at the turn of the 20th century, right before World War II. We saw a lot of innovation: electricity, oil, the combustion steam engine, light bulb, telephone, right? Lots of things really changed how we worked, how we thought, how we lived, and most of all, changed the economy. The third revolution can be thought of as a digital revolution, right? So starting in the 1980s, with the invention of the personal computer and the internet, and how much that has totally changed our world, that we're now in the information age. It's a totally different world than it was 200 years ago. But now what we need to be aware of is we're actually entering what some people are calling the fourth revolution, which is just emerging now, and it's really emerging as a synthesis of physical, digital, and biological systems, right? And we see this in artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, 5G wireless network, 3D printing, applied genetics, fully autonomous vehicles, decentralized sustainable energy, right? All these things have great capacity to totally change the world again. But the question we need to ask is, are our answers in technology, right? Like, what is the broader framework? What is the larger context that these emerging technologies are arising in? How will they be organized and coordinated? And we can see in the past, every technological advance has led to both benefits and problems, right? There's been great advances through all those revolutions, but there was also sweatshop labor, right, which was terrible. And now we're dealing with the effects of being addicted to our cell phones and like not being able to really manage or even understand how it's affecting us neurologically to be a screen-based like interface human experience, right? And one thing we also need to grapple with is that the stakes are getting higher and higher. So with each of those changes, there might have been problems, but this is the first time in history that we're really facing global problems, where when we think about nanotechnology and artificial intelligence, for instance, we really don't know what the possibilities for the downside are. So all the more reason why we need really complex, really thoughtful, really deliberate thinking going in to managing these systems. So these are the kinds of things that our generations have to grapple with, and it's the kind of things that we're leaving for our children to grapple with. So all of this is kind of in the background, right? This is all the water in which we're swimming in that we don't necessarily think about or spell out or maybe necessarily read a lot about, but it's there and we're all living in it. And the more aware of it we are and are bringing it present when we're actually thinking about our children and our grandchildren, I just think it really serves us to do that. Because thinking about kids just right now, what is the impact on children on this context, right? There's a lot of downstream pressure on children to be successful. There's a lot of screen addiction. And we need to think about how the social environment is impacting our children and what we can do to protect them and to nurture their well-being, right? And the overall stress that I think a lot of parents are feeling nowadays is finding its way into children's lives. It's finding its way into schools. There's a lot of pressure on sort of narrow ideas of what success is all about. So this is part of what we have to come to terms with. Is like, what is the impact of this environment on our children? What type of healthy, positive environment can we envision for our children? And how do we ensure that we create it, right? There was a recent article out recently called How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation, right? And it's a great unpacking of just sort of even for young adults who are now entering the workforce, how much things have changed from like 20, 50 years ago in terms of people are just working all the time. It's nonstop. You're expected to always be on your email. You're checking your phone more times a day than you really can count. So we need to kind of take a step back and look at the sum total of this experience and think about, is that the world we want our children being born into? Is that really what we want? So how do we raise and educate our children in this completely unprecedented context? So in order to answer that question, I think we actually need to step back a little bit further, right? Because once you start going down that road, it starts to get stressful, it starts to get overwhelming. It's like, oh my God, it seems really negative. This is such a downer. But actually, I believe that if we can actually keep stepping back and keep expanding our view of what's happening, we find reasons to really make better sense of it all and really find our place in the grand scheme of things, right? So the question is, if the water in which we're swimming is this sort of economic, technological, really stressful, complex, social, cultural world, what is the ecosystem in which that water was created, right? What is the larger ecosystem of experience and of evolution? And I think evolution is actually going to hold some of the answers there. And what are the implications for how we should be raising our children and working to shape our human environments based on what we know about evolution and about human development? So I want to talk a little bit about human development and get to brain development and child development. But first of all, just generally, to just acknowledge that human development is part of a broader evolutionary process, right? It's been happening for over 13 billion years, as far as we know. It's not like it's stopped, right? Evolution is an ongoing process. The universe is still evolving, and we are an expression of that evolution, right? So finding a way to come to terms with that as a human being, I think, can be a very empowering and enlightening thing, because we can begin to see education as the process through which we determine and support and direct the evolution of our species, right? Like, that's kind of what education is. Like, how are we directing the evolution of humanity? So we need to broaden and deepen our understanding of what the implications of that are and realize, it's much bigger than survival of the fittest and descent with modification, right? There's something much bigger than that happening. And it's really more about understanding the emergence of complex systems that can't be reduced to lifeless matter. Because whatever evolution is, it's complex, it's nonlinear, it's emergent, and for higher life forms like us, it's as much about cooperation as it is about competition, right? And that is being demonstrated scientifically in different areas. Now we're getting beyond sort of initial Darwinian and social Darwinian types of thinking and sort of starting to complexify our understanding of what human development entails. And we're starting to recognize that if it's anything, right, evolution is the evolution of insides and outsides, right, individuals and collectives. So you can experience it not only scientifically and objectively in the world and through experiments like telescopes and microscopes and understanding the evolution of matter, but it's also something you can start to experience subjectively, right, directly in your own experience. How do you experience the way that the universe is emerging right now, right, which is a question that I want to come back to later. So, thinking about life in that evolutionary context, that takes us into thinking about the evolution of the human being, the development of the human being, and therefore human development, brain development, child development, right? And all that is really relevant to education. So many people are familiar with sort of basic stages of development as framed by somebody like Piaget, where you're going through this sort of one-directional process. It's not really linear or clean. It's kind of messy. Age ranges are approximate, but there is this process that people are going to. But what we're starting to realize is this sort of formal operational structure of thinking where people, are adult, mature thinking, capable of logical thought, coherent thought. That's not the be-all, end-all of humanity, right? Like, how does humanity keep going? What are actually potentials for humanity? So, and there's many different models of this, and there's many different theories. There's domain-specific theories, there's global theories, and I want to state as clearly as possible that all developmental theories are dependent on particular methodologies and models. So none can claim to be the be-all and end-all of what human development is, right? It's not, we don't want to fall prey to a sort of myth of the given where it's like, well, this is just reality, and this model tells us really clearly what that reality is. It's more like every single kind of assessment that's done is enacting a certain kind of data with people, and as more and more kinds of those assessments are done, more and more models can be created. We can see more how they all fit together, and some pictures of human emergence can start to come into view, but it's important not to overly reify any particular model or any particular stage theory, right? Because the stages can be broken up in different ways. Different researchers can look at them in different ways. So that's just a sort of caveat as we go into this, because it's really important, I think, as someone trying to make sense of the world, not to fall into what somebody named Hansi Freinacht calls it developmental blindness. So we don't want to be blind to the fact that we all are on some developmental journey, and the more we understand about that journey, the more we'll understand about humanity. But we also don't want to over-reify it or overemphasize it and start putting people in boxes as though we're talking about kinds of people. Because everything I'm going to say about human development, I'm not talking about kinds of people. I'm talking about structures of thinking. I'm talking about symbolic codes. I'm talking about different strategies for language games that people use to make sense of the world that are potentially accessible by all people, right? It's just a matter of what has your personal history been, what's your social context, what's your environment, what's your social group, how have you been influenced, and where are you at in your own cognitive complexity, right? Which is a path that we are all on. But we all have a metaphysical framework behind what we think is real, right? We all have a cognitive conceptual architecture that we use to make sense of the world. So understanding what those possible architectures are will help us to understand the paths we have available to us to choose for the future. So one such model, in addition to Piaget, there's a man out of Harvard named Michael Commons, and he developed a model of hierarchical complexity, right? So it's a way of understanding the potentially increasing complexity of human cognition, where each stage coordinates the actions of a preceding stage. So you can go from constructing stories made up of concrete facts, to then finding abstract variables in those stories, to then finding relationships between those variables, to then finding systems of relationships, to then finding common properties and principles that are present in different systems, right? So it just keeps getting more and more complex. So for instance, thinking about the environment, right? If you're at a basic abstract logical level, you might see one thing as true and just have that truth be the basis of your whole theory, right? So if I'm at the abstract level, I might say, well, people destroy the environment because they're greedy. Like, people are greedy. Like, this sucks. This is so frustrating. People are greedy, and the economy is terrible, and we're just destroying the planet. And that's a downer, right? But then if you get to be, a little bit more complex in your thinking, you might realize, well, I'm a person, and I'm not that greedy all the time, and I know people who aren't that greedy, but our priorities are kind of out of balance, right? So there's some tensions. It's like, well, we care about the world. We just maybe don't care about it as much as our immediate gratification that we get from having to support our family and have a job and take care of people. So it's like, if we would just make better choices, even though things are as they are, maybe if we recycle more, if we drive a Prius, if we do certain things, then things will get better, right? So it's like, okay, well, maybe we can work with that. But if you get a little bit more complex in your thinking from a systemic level, you'd really just start to see into how the economy works, how it's structured, and see that just the way that it's set up, there are systemic flaws in our economic system that are going to cause periodic crises and that may lead to collapse. And you can just start to really see how that's operating, and no amount of individual kind of behavior is going to monitor that. We would have to do something broader, something more systemic to really have an impact. And then at the metasystemic level, you might start to think, well, wow, I really see kind of what's happening in the economy and how that works. And then you can see a disconnect with biological systems, right? And you can see that there's a disconnect between these different systems. Like there's no feedback loop where the economic system and the biosphere are like giving information to each other so that would affect our behavior in the economic sphere, right? Like they're decoupled. So therefore, thinking metasystemically, you'd have to realize we would have to create some feedback loops in the economic system to change our behavior if we're going to avoid collapse, because it's not getting that feedback from the biosphere, from sort of more natural systems, right? So there's a disconnect between natural systems and human-made systems, and we have to be the bridge. We have to be the ones who actually think metasystemically and start to be that bridge between systems. So in addition to thinking about cognitive complexity, this image is from another model. Kershner is another person sort of developing theories of cognitive development, also out of Harvard. And then there's another way of thinking about development, which I think is also important, but can get in some ways more murky and more complicated, which is thinking about the development of values, right? So there does seem to be some development of human values that takes place in groups of people. And you can think of it as a sort of progression of symbolic codes that we can internalize that are somewhat independent of cognitive complexity. And your value structure is like an overall pattern for your mind, right? It's a sort of equilibrium upon which your values and your worldview tend to stabilize. So for instance, if you have a value system that really prizes order, hierarchy, purpose, and rules, that might be like a dominant sort of code in your group, in your tribe, in your nation, in your family, where it's like order really matters. It's more of a traditional approach to reality and what's right and what's wrong, and it's really black and white. Whereas another value system can be thought of as more rational, scientific, more logical, maybe a little bit less traditional. That could be associated more with like modernity and the modern world. It's sort of a shift in value structure. And then we can see in the sort of what we think of as the postmodern world, we see different values emerging and starting to become spread more widely, right? Like compassion, sensitivity, diversity, right? And being sort of egalitarian and in some ways anti-hierarchy, right? Those are values that can emerge for groups of people. And different individuals can be at different levels of cognitive complexity and interpreting those sort of symbolic worlds at different degrees of complexity, right? So you can have a really complex thinker who will out-argue you even though he's stuck at a more traditional value structure, right? And you can have a teenager who's already really been exposed to postmodernity and egalitarianism and feminism and lots of values that have emerged over time that are potentially more complex. But if that teenager doesn't really have a rich and complex cognitive architecture, his or herself, it's not really going to stand up in an argument to that more complex traditional conservative, right? So they kind of go together, where the more complex values emerge in relationship to increase cognitive complexity, but we can't confuse them. And that's something that's kind of getting teased apart in the literature, which we could talk more and more about, but I don't want to go too far down that road. But one thing to think about is another thing an author Hansi Freinacht talks about is what he calls the great stretching out, which is this idea that in the world today, there's a wider spectrum and a wider span of different perspectives that are sort of interacting with each other in society than ever before. If you think about human history, if you grew up in a tribe, there wasn't that much perspectival diversity in that tribe. There was one truth, one reality, one way of doing things, and that's just the way it was. And even throughout time, as we grew to nation states and big cities, the amount of diversity of perspectives and values in any group was not that broad. And now one of the challenges we're facing that leads back to some of the things I was talking about at the beginning, as we're thinking about globally interdependent world, global problems, we have all these different views and values and perspectives and different degrees of complexity all kind of battling with each other, right? So it's this great stretching out that is really causing a lot of the complications and complexity in our society. But ideally, part of what I want to try to get our thinking to today is that ideally, as we begin to see this, as we begin to see that this is what's emerging and that these are the things that are unfolding, that we will begin to identify not with a particular value structure, but with the process as a whole, right? Like, how do we actually step back and see the whole process emerging and not get stuck overly identifying ourselves or our thinking with just one structure that's inherently in tension with other structures? Because we all have a sort of complexity bias. We all have a values bias, right? We all, intuitively prefer forms of reasoning that resonate with our values that we've been exposed to and with the sort of degree of complexity that we're used to operating from. But it's a process that's available to all of us to kind of get metacognitive about that and start to think about our own thinking more. So if you think about where we're at now, you can see in the world sort of three predominant structures of cultural meaning, right, that are very prevalent in the world. And we could think of them as traditional, modern, and postmodern. So the point here is that there are stage differences between the cultural codes that people who resonate with these different kinds of thinking are using, right? So we're not talking about kinds of people, but we're talking about available perspectives, and we're talking about the structures and the patterns of language and thought that have been established in our social world that people are growing into and using, but sort of using mostly unconsciously, right? So part of the point here is to become more conscious of our values, more conscious of our thinking, more conscious of the language games that we're playing with each other, to avoid conflict, to try to transcend conflict, and to really think about where we're going so that we can keep going on our path forward. Because I think that when you're looking at a country, when you're looking at a state, when you're looking at a neighborhood, when you're looking at a family, when you're looking at a group of friends, whatever sort of subgroup you're looking at, once you start to get these background structures and like an awareness of these background structures present in your own sort of conceptual architecture, you can begin to see that each population does have a sort of demographic, developmental center of gravity of some kind. And there are some people at earlier stages and some people at later stages. And the later stages are more logically and more functionally in tune with more complex societies. So there is a way in which we do want to progress through these stages, but not naively and not thinking that it's a simple matter of better and worse, or that any individual who is, for instance, sounding more like a postmodern and is sort of trying to articulate values that are associated with postmodernity, they're not necessarily better people. They're not necessarily even more cognitively complex. That's just the value that they're aligning with in that moment. But again, we need to think about the whole. Where are we all headed? How are we all getting along with each other, understanding where each other are coming from, seeing that we're all at a different place on the path, but we're all kind of on the same path. Because part of my thinking about this too is that we can see these predominant perspectives, we can see these structures of thinking showing up in the world in lots of different ways. But the more metacognition we have about these different ways of thinking, these different symbolic codes, these different structures of cognitive complexity, the more we kind of see that as the ground, the more empathy we will actually have for other people, right? I feel like it actually leads to having less judgment about people and not more, because we have more understanding of where they're coming from and how they're sort of making sense of their world, which, as we pointed out at the beginning, is not a simple or easy thing to do, right? We're all overwhelmed by the world in different ways, and we're all grasping for different values, structures, frameworks to make sense of the world, right? And it's our sense-making that is really in crisis. So helping each other along on the path of making sense of the world is really kind of what it's all about. And as we think about politics and the sort of culture wars that many of us are embedded in, we can see that culture wars and climate collapse are both a part of a meta-crisis of human development, right? Back to the beginning. It's like we need to have the competence to really deal with the world as it is now and not be living in the past. And we need to stop constructing problems in ways that confound our ability to really address the root causes of issues. So like, for instance, maybe an example would help. So as a hypothetical example, say that there was a political leader who promised to build a wall or a fence of some kind, right? And he also promised that, if that didn't happen, he was going to shut down the government. So that's a really sort of basic, like, formal way of thinking, right? Like, if this, then that, because I said so, right? Like, I need to stick to that principle. But that approach to addressing immigration, when immigration is a wicked problem, right? Immigration is complex. Immigration is multinational. There's so many laws, bureaucracies, human beings involved with many different stakeholders, right? So if you were actually going to interface with many different stakeholders to solve a problem like that, those stakeholders would all need to be, going back to our thinking here about, formal, systemic, metasystemic, those different stakeholders in that conversation would need to at least be at a systemic level of complexity to really understand the system that they're representing and to advocate for it. And somebody who is trying to manage that conversation amongst multiple stakeholders coming from different perspectives should probably have a metasystemic view, right, where they can actually see how some of these different systems work related to immigration and start to coordinate those conflicts, coordinate those values, right, and not be attached to any particular limited logic within any one of those more limited groups or stakeholders, right? So if you have somebody coming at the problem with that sort of formal level of complexity, they're at least 2 stages short of what is really going to be necessary to really tackle and respond to that issue in an appropriate fashion. Just one totally hypothetical example. But that person is clearly in over his head, right? He's in over his head, and that is not a rare thing. Many of us are in over our heads nowadays, whether it's at our job, even just in our conversations with our spouse, with our friends. It's just like we're not always able to make sense at the level that people are asking of us, which is actually why Robert Keegan out of Harvard wrote a book called In Over Our Heads, right? And it's really explaining, I think, in a really helpful way, all the kinds of ways in which so many of us are perpetually not quite ready cognitively for the environments that we're thrust into. So there is this developmental gap, right? There's a gap between what's expected of us as people and how we're able to show up and how we're able to make sense of the world. It's not like we need to point our fingers at those people as though they're somehow deficient. It actually is a very widespread, just human problem, and we need to find a way to support each other in actually closing that developmental gap. And that actually should be the foundational purpose of education, right? Is like helping children to develop so that they are competent and ready to face the challenges ahead of them. There's a lot of talk about like 21st century demands, right? So there are conversations happening in education about 21st century education, 21st century skills, self-management, innovation, responsibility, self-direction, creativity. These are the qualities that we need children to have and future workers to have. But what we're really talking about are developmental demands, right? And the clearer sense we have of that, the better position will be to actually help those children who are growing up. Because our children will need to be self-transforming and always learning and always growing if they're going to be system transforming, right? And we need our children to help us change the systems that we've created for them. So that should be our goal. So we have to create the generative conditions that will enable that growth. So again, thinking about this developmental gap and what do we need to do as adults, I'm arguing that we need to make connections between human development, education, and social complexity. We need to become responsible for our own evolution and our own growth. We have to try to understand all these different stages and all these different perspectives along a spectrum in order to create a society that can really solve the problems that we're facing. So now thinking about education in this context, again, historical context helps to understand where we're at in schools. One way of describing public education in this country for the past 30 years would be as a bipartisan failure to protect children from neoliberalism. That would actually be the way that I would sum it up. And when we're thinking about neoliberalism, we're thinking about privatization, deregulation, austerity, having some sort of idea of meritocracy operating in the background, and basically having market-based solutions to social and cultural problems, right? And that has not been a successful approach in education. It's a very sort of modernist view, sort of that kind of thinking, that structure of value and thought sort of emerged around the time of the Industrial Revolution, maybe even earlier with the Enlightenment, and sort of basically like having notions of social efficiency and figuring out where everybody's going to go, getting people ready to work in factories. So it's like sorting people and just having a very managerial, like top-down approach to really what it's all about. And the sort of infrastructure of public education has been locked in that for too long, at a point where now it's just out of sync with the times, right? We need to update our operating system. We need to update our educational systems to be more aligned with not only postmodernity, but what's emerging after postmodernity, right? And what is more aligned with human development. And there's a lot of, in the educational world, in the educational field, there's a lot of unpacking of this, of the problems of education, of the problems of the educational system, and how the main drivers of educational policy and practice have really not been influenced by what we know about learning and what we know about human development. Those haven't really been the drivers of what's happening. The development of technology, the demands of bureaucracy and social efficiency, and profit motive to kind of, again, keep the GDP going up. We have to keep pumping money into the system. We have to keep focusing on tech. And we have to kind of keep the whole thing going in that big picture, but it's not really stopping and looking at what's really best for kids. So the aim of schooling, really from the industrial economy times to today, we just haven't really updated it to make it really be about being based on the learning sciences. There's so many other political, social, and economic factors involved in what's happening. And this is not to blame teachers at all. As a teacher, I'd like that would be the last thing that I would do. It's really about, again, understanding this much bigger picture and not even focusing on the level of like school system or school district as though it's the principal's fault or the teacher's fault or the superintendent's fault or even the governor's fault, right? We need just broader thinking at every level of our educational system. Another way to think about this is sort of what I was just saying, the gap between research and policy, right? So there's one thing that we know is that the things that we're learning in our ivory towers about brain development, neuroscience, the science of pedagogy, is not being translated into policy, right? It's sort of similar to climate change in that way, where we have tons of science, we even have tons of technology to help us out of the problem that we're in, but we're just not implementing it. And the reasons are psychological and political and social. And we're stuck in this sort of dysfunctional, anachronistic modern paradigm which continues to dominate public education, which again is a legacy of the industrial economy, linear efficiency, partisan politics, and in some ways social Darwinism, to sort of thinking that the inequities that are perpetuated are actually it's the way it's supposed to be. Some people are meant to be bankers and politicians, and some people are meant to be factory workers and house cleaners, and that's just the way it is. So we need to get out of that and think about how do we actually maximize the potential of every child. So luckily, we actually know a lot about how to do that too, right? Like I said, similar to many of the different sciences, we have a lot of information at our fingertips. We just need to figure out how to implement it and enact it. So what do we know? What should we be doing, right? So now let's get to the part of thinking about what should schools look like? What are things that we should be thinking about as parents and educators? Well, some things that we know are that we know that cognitive learning and social emotional learning are both addressed when we address the overall needs of each child, right? We know that engagement is really key, and that there's a difference between generative knowledge and passive or inert knowledge. We know that we can't reduce learning to the input of information or the ability to regurgitate facts, but it's really more about how are we shaping the whole person? What are the habits of work and the habits of mind that children are learning are sort of natural and normal, and their engagement with the world that really matter. We know that children learn from people they love, and that emotion is central to reason, motivation, and attention and memory. There's a great article out recently by David Brooks about just that, about really how if you look at the most successful schools and teachers and children, it's what's really at the heart of those situations is relationships, close relationships, trusting relationships where people can really be themselves and seen and loved for who they are. We know that children do not learn from screens as well as they learn from people. There's lots of studies coming out about trying to teach children language through screen-based media versus actual human interaction, and it's just night and day. Like, they're not absorbing the information. We are not wired, we have not evolved to interact with screens. We have evolved to interact with our family and our tribe and the people who love us, right? And we need to not lose that as we move into the 21st century. We also know that fear and anxiety cripple learning and neurological functioning. So we have to create environments where fear and anxiety are minimized. So one great way to think about learning is from Edward Hallowell in his book, The Childhood Roots of Adult Happiness. Many different models of human learning. I think this is a good one, though, because it starts with connection and how every child needs and deserves to be connected to people who really care about them. And through that, having the opportunity to play and practice, which are really kind of synonymous in a way. If you're engaged in what you're doing, if you're playing with what you're doing, you're practicing whatever skills you're working on in a playful and engaged way, you're going to be learning. With your whole body mind, you're going to be learning. Through that is actually how you get to mastery, and it's through mastery that you get to recognition. The more you get authentic, genuine recognition for authentic, genuine mastery, that deepens your connection to your group, and then it's a virtuous cycle, right? So some key points here is that if we're thinking about morals and ethics, connection is the root of moral behavior, right? You can't teach didactically someone how to be a good person. You have to be in relationships with people you actually care about and who actually care about you to naturally become a person who will do good things for those people in that context. And then as you grow, learn to sort of broaden that circle of compassion and empathy, right? And mastery is the root of self-esteem, right? You have to actually have children in situations where they're experiencing success authentically, which means they're in developmentally appropriate environments, not being pushed too fast and getting negative feedback from their environment. Because if you're trying to push kids too fast and they're getting that negative feedback, that they can internalize some negative self-concepts right there. So we want to keep challenging them, and that's more of an art than a science. There's a real balance between challenging children, pushing children, and having those habits of work to have perseverance and not taking it easy on them or letting them lag or slack, but also making sure that you're in tune with them, which is why if you're connected with them, if they're in really great relationships, the adults who are working with them are going to kind of know what's appropriate, what's their next step for them as an individual, not some sort of standardized idea about where they should be because of their age or their grade, but actually interacting with them as individuals to see what's appropriate for them. And also this notion about play, I mean, it could just as easily say work there instead of play, right? But play and work is a false dichotomy. Like if you're engaged in something, you're working and you're playing. Play can be creative, self-directed, engaged, and it's really the best way to learn. And anyone who has really found a job that they love, that sort of distinction between work and play, if you're lucky enough, kind of fades away. It doesn't mean anything, right? Another crucial thing to be thinking about in terms of early childhood education is the importance of fantasy, make-believe, pretend play, story, narrative, myth, right? This is how we develop language. It's how we develop different ideas about what's possible as people. It enables emotional catharsis, emotional transference for things that are really difficult to process. It's the building block of sequential and abstract thinking, if-and thinking, if-then thinking. Metaphor and imagination really develop our conceptual structures. It fosters symbolic thought, imagination, and it's really holistic. So if you're playing in an imaginative way as a young child, you are just very naturally developing in a way that includes cognitive, social, emotional, interpersonal, intrapersonal development. All those things are included when you're part of a group of people that can play together. It really is like we need to unpack the simplicity of it. And it just so happens that it's what kids love to do when they're young. So sometimes we actually just need to get out of their way a little bit. Something I want to spend a little bit of time on specifically is thinking about literacy and technology, right? Because this is one thing that I see a lot of confusion about in school systems. So we need to be thinking about the timing between skill development and brain development. So one thing that's good to be aware of with brain development is a process of myelination, right? So myelin is a laminated membrane structure that surrounds the axons in your brain, and it allows electrical insulation, and it increases the speed of brain processing, right? And every child's brain is going through that process throughout the beginning of their life. Different parts of your brain are being myelinated at different times, so they're kind of like in some ways coming online at different times. So there's some things that you actually just can't rush. But not every child is exactly the same, right? There are general time frames, but by months or even years, they could be a little bit different, right? So, and there's because reading evolved as a later part of human life, like it's a fairly recent innovation, there's no reading part of the brain, right? There are different parts of the brain that have to be myelinated, and then connections between those parts of the brain have to be like online and ready to connect in order for all the different things that are going on in the brain of a child who's learning to read to kind of all click, right? So for some children, that clicks age 3, 4, 5. Some children not till 6 or 7, right? So what's important is actually for all those children, age 3 through 7, tons of exposure to language, to concepts, to ideas, to literature, to metaphors, to imagination, and so that they have lots of input and understanding about things, whether or not they can decode text. And of course, along the way, at school and maybe from home, they're getting access to phonological instruction, phonics. They're being taught to read, but that shouldn't really be the emphasis in those ages. As long as they're getting a lot of exposure and they're getting the sort of phonemic awareness building blocks put in place for them. For most children who don't have a learning disability, it will click at some point between 5 and 7. And there's absolutely no benefit to learning to read at 4 or 5 instead of 6 or 7, right? And there's lots of examples of many of the most brilliant, accomplished, imaginative people being late talkers, late readers, even late walkers. Everyone's just at a different timetable. But every single child has a right to be in a school where wherever they're at on that spectrum when they're 4, 5, and 6 years old, they can feel good about themselves. They can feel, I'm a reader, I'm a writer, I'm a mathematician. And if their peer is sort of decoding chapter books and they're really having a hard time getting the basic phonemic awareness down, yes, they need support. They need teachers to help them learn how to read. But it shouldn't be the be-all, end-all. It shouldn't be put up on a pedestal. And they should be in an environment that is play-based and developmentally appropriate so that across the board, they're still developing healthily, even if because of how their brain is wired or for other factors, it's just taking them a little bit longer. Similarly with tech, and the connection between reading and tech is important too, because when children do get old enough to read books, it's good for us to know there's a huge difference between reading books and being online and clicking on things. What's happening in your brain is two totally different processes. When you're reading, your brain is moving much slower, and it has what you're reading is much more likely to go into your long-term memory if you're just going at the pace of reading a book. Whereas if you're incessantly interacting with online media, you have cognitive overload. You're experiencing continuous partial attention where you're not fully engaged in thinking about whatever it is that you're doing. And we're at a really crucial point in history where we are determining what are the social norms for how we interact with screens, right? That's now. That's our generations figuring that out. What will be the human relationship to screens? And the data that's coming out in terms of the downsides of interaction with screens is really, really something to think about. It's not good for your brain. It's not good for your eyes. It's not good for your attention span. It's not good for things going into your long-term memory. And I think it would be helpful to see the rapid increase in autism and ADHD as environmental adaptations, right? Our entire society is becoming more autistic. And it's not a coincidence that our relationship to technology is changing. So that's something we need to be thinking about as parents. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 0 screen time for children under the age of 2. And after that, less than 2 hours a day at any age of childhood. And it actually is possible. My daughter did not look at a screen hardly at all till she was 3. Since then, she's 9 now, we watch maybe 1 to 2 hours per week, right? Because we'll watch a family movie. There's really no reason for my child to be looking at a screen any more than watching a family movie once a week. She is not at any loss. She's no less a digital native than any of her friends. And whatever technology she's using 10 years from now, she'll figure out how to use it 10 years from now, right? Because we don't even know what that's going to be. So the idea that we have to prepare our children to use technology by making them use iPads or keyboards it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. We need to actually stop going along with these really empty tropes that are becoming really, really popular. We're not preparing our children for the future by having them type on a QWERTY keyboard or use an iPad, right? By the time they're my age, we probably won't be using QWERTY keyboards anymore or iPads, right? And in the meantime, you're setting them back developmentally because they did not evolve and come into this world to interact with screens. That's not how they're tuned. You're shutting down their brain development because what's happening is just a much different process. So we need to just stop and think about that. One thing I want to hit on too, props to my friend Zach Stein for laying this out for me in terms of thinking about a really dangerous metaphor, because we also think about the brain as a computer sometimes too, and like the mind or brain as a computer, and I just want to point out how that's a really destructive metaphor, actually. If you think about a person as a computer, they're passive and they're programmable, right? As opposed to being active and autonomously growing and having emotion be a driving force of what they're doing. Computers don't have emotions, right? If you think of a person as a computer, you're thinking that quality can be represented by a single metric, right? It's either working or it's not working, as opposed to quality of mind being much more complex and needing much more diverse array of assessments to really understand what's going on with someone. When you think of a computer, you think of variability as a problem, right? Every Mac should be the same. If something's different about it, something's wrong with it, and you need to fix it, right? That's a terrible metaphor for people. Variability should be expected, right? And it's a result of dynamic growth and should be fostered, right? Like we should be fostering diversity and uniqueness, not like a computer at all. And if you think about teaching like computer programming, It's like you're just putting info in and they should be regurgitating that, as opposed to thinking of teaching like environmental stewardship, right? Where you're sort of letting plants grow and they're all different and they all need care and attention. Anyway, point made. So on the flip side, nature, right? Like a lot of our children are actually having nature deficit disorder, right? We are thinking about our evolutionary history. We're used to being outside, right? Like the ecosystem of our mind and brain naturally tunes in with the ecosystem of whatever environment we're in, right? If we're inside all the time, like that's what we're tuning into. If we're outside, there is a cognitive and emotional release that happens from the attunement of our ecosystem and our external ecosystem, right? It's sort of fractal in that way. So the mind-brain is much more like a complex ecosystem than a complicated machine like a computer. And time in nature allows us to resonate with nature in an important way, because thinking back to our bigger problem of like, how are we being stewards for our environment? How are we taking care of the biosphere? If we don't have a healthy relationship from the beginning of our lives, that's not about scaring kids with data about climate change. It's actually about letting them actually have a really natural, organic attunement with nature. Then we're not setting them up to really care for that which is actually taking care of them. And on the flip side, just thinking cognitively, we need downtime to process long-term memory. If it's go, go, go all the time, if we're always on our screens, we don't have the downtime that's actually crucial for long-term memory development. And movement as well is really important. Like having time for just physical exercise and being engaged in your whole body mind is so important, so important. So again, when it comes to early childhood especially, earlier is not better. The dichotomy between academics and social emotional learning is a false distinction. Overall cognitive development is rooted in the brain and in relationship to one's environment. Overall mental health actually aligns with the joys of childhood. We can let our kids just be happy kids, and we'll actually, in a large part, be doing what's best for them in terms of their overall development. And overall long-term development is not improved by rushing it. Attention to process leads to exceptional outcomes, right? That's actually something I like to say at my current school, Carolina Friends School. When you really focus on process and you really are thoughtful with each child, that is the best way to ensure exceptional outcomes. Thinking about what outcomes are going to be can throw off the whole process. So, Child Development 101, it really does come down to love and play. It's not completely that simple, because I would argue that every parent loves their child. Not every child feels loved, right? So there are ways, it's really about creating environments where children feel loved, where they know that they're loved, where they know that they have unconditional positive self-regard, right? That will enable them to enact their best self, to self-actualize as a whole human being. And when they experience rejection, they often experience that as self-rejection. When they experience conditional acceptance, they often internalize that as conditional self-acceptance, right? So we're sort of teaching them how to relate to themselves, how to think about themselves, how to have presence in the world. So we need to give them that loving presence to model that for them, because that's also a primary aspect of how kids learn. They learn through osmosis. They learn through presence. They learn through modeling. They learn from the people that they're with. So they need teachers and parents who are engaged, awake, with their phones down, and alive and excited about what they're doing in the world, if that's what we want for our children. So what should we be looking for in schools? We should be looking for schools that have a holistic understanding of development and aren't just focused on so-called academics. We should have schools that really see children as individuals, like sacred, precious individuals, and we really get to know them as individuals and listen to them as individuals and let them figure out what they are going to do to help us get out of the messes that we're in. We need tribal classrooms in the sense that, what's a tribe, right? It's a group of people of different ages who know each other really well and care about each other over a period of time, right? So that's what a classroom should feel like. That's what a school should be as a 21st century tribe or community, because that's what we're missing nowadays. It's part of what we're missing. It needs to have a developmental understanding, right? So earlier is not always better. Really seeing the whole arc, the whole trajectory of childhood, for instance, from preschool through high school, and what are the things that are appropriate at each stage. And it is not just the case that we should backwards plan as though it's a linear process. Childhood is not a linear process. They're much more like butterflies or something organic than that, than like a machine that can just be programmed. And post-conventional is something I want to highlight too, which simply means that as a school, as an educational community, as parents, we should be able to be really clear that our overarching goals are not limited to being successful in the world as it is, right? We should not have conventional notions of success. Conventional notions of success should not be driving our educational systems. It's not about being successful. It's not about what college you go to. It's not about what job you get. It's about being of service. It's about making the world a better place, being post-conventional, being able to actually criticize and understand your conventional world so that you can help its evolution, right? And if that's not what's animating schools, then what's animating schools, right? So again, it's back to us thinking about our values. And it's not that it's bad to want your kids to be rich or to be tech savvy or to be great students. Those are legitimate values shared by a lot of people. But they're not the only values available to us. There are broader, deeper values available to us, right? And we can tune into those broader and deeper values. And we can start to see that childhood, like life itself, is not a means to an end, right? So there's this sort of both and thinking here in terms of understanding development and understanding the process of development and wanting to foster healthy growth and emergence. And then seeing that somewhat ironically that is best fostered by dropping all of that and focusing on the process and being present with people wherever they're at, whether they're 3 or 33. And that's really what's going to help them get to the next stage on their path, right? So you start to see the whole path and the whole process, but then meet every individual where they are with empathy and compassion. So we can get metacognitive about our values, and we can increase the complexity of our perspectives, but we can also just show up better for people. So thinking for us, what do we need to do? I've already talked about what our approaches to parenting and schooling can be. Thinking about personal growth, I'll point out that it's great that meditation is becoming more popular, mindfulness is becoming more popular, and there's a real developmental logic to that as well. One way of describing one aspect of the developmental process is, the perspective that you are used to inhabiting sort of unconsciously, the perspective that you look through. When you can objectify that and look at that and see that sort of as an object instead of being fused with it as a subject, that's a way of increasing your metacognition and actually taking a broader and deeper view. That happens structurally as people go through the different stages of complexity. It also happens actually moment to moment when you're meditating, right? If you're actually just stopping, identifying with whatever thoughts are going through your head, whatever conceptual architecture you're using in your ongoing thinking, if you actually just look at it and just disembed yourself from it, you're already automatically coming from a different place, right? You are the awareness that's aware of that thinking. You're no longer fused with that thinking. And the more you do that, the more expansive your view becomes, right? And the more able you are to hold a broader and deeper just awareness of what's going on around you, what's going on inside of you. And in terms of social life, we need to really support teachers in schools more and help them resist standardization and quantification of education. We're stuck in this sort of linear, formal, modern notion of what it should look like and feel like and what the goals are. And we really need to help nudge everyone past that conversation. So there's a lot of good people doing good work in the world. Part of what I've done with these slides is just to put a lot of books up here. People who have influenced me. None of these ideas are actually very original. There's a lot of great information out there. There's a lot of people doing good work. If I actually had to highlight 2 books in terms of education, it's a book that's actually just coming out by Zachary Stein, Education in a Time Between Worlds, will be a book that really uncovers and unpacks a lot of really interesting ideas related to some of the things that I've talked about. And in terms of thinking about society and politics and human development, I would recommend The Listening Society, which really lays out this notion of if we kind of take as a given that we need to take care of people, that one of the purposes of society is the healthy flourishing of humanity, we need to think about how do we move beyond are already well-established notions of the welfare state and like taking care of people in terms of having a economic safety net, to really the next step of that, like welfare state 2.0, would be taking care of people's psychological and emotional and developmental needs, right? How do we actually create social structures, political structures that foster human development so that it's a positive feedback loop, so that people are more likely to continue to help to make things better instead of getting stuck and having arrested development. And he's sort of unpacking a model of thinking about politics that looks at some Northern European countries as potential examples of sort of situations that are ripe for taking that next step, but nobody's really done it yet. And it's something that we need to actually be thinking about. How do we make that happen around the world to create systems of laws and policies that are actually supportive of people's overall growth and development? So our job is to create a new world for our children to swim in, right? We sort of become aware of the water that we're swimming in, and we have to make a leap. We have to make a jump to something else. It's not linear, but if we play the game of life in accordance with long-term trends, with a bigger picture of an evolving society that's already gone from an agrarian society to industrial society to technological society, now we're entering a sort of postmodern, meta-modern, globally interdependent world, right? That's very laden with technology and is very dependent on technology. We need to have this sort of whole scope to really understand how to do that. Because the future is not just going to be an extension of past trends. It's actually going to be, there are radically new possibilities that are available to us. And I'll end with just this notion of like understanding that overwhelm is possible. And it's not easy to necessarily become an expert in all these domains or to really think through all the things that I've touched on tonight. But I hope part of what's come across is that there's a sort of simplicity on the other side of complexity, that if we can just start to grapple with this big picture and we start to actually do the work of meditating ourselves, getting a sense of what's going on inside of ourselves, getting a sense of where we're coming from, how do we relate to our screens, how do we relate to technology, how do we relate to our own thinking, how do we relate to our own identity, what is our identity, what sort of norms of how to be a human are we passing on to our children? That if we can sort of attune to the evolutionary field that's unfolding and experience ourself as part of that unfolding process, and the more we can sort of stabilize our attention and our perception, the more expansive our view can become and the more helpful we can be for people. And that's all I've got. If you are interested in more, I do post a lot of articles and things like that I think are helpful on my Twitter feed. And I do also have a Patreon page if you want to support my work. I'm trying to just get out, give talks. I have some writing projects going. I've been on some podcasts, and I'm just trying to really do what I can in addition to the work that I'm doing at a school, trying to think about what I can do that would be helpful. So if you want to check out some of the other things that I've done and I'm doing, you can find me on Twitter or on Patreon, and I'd love to hear from you. And with that, we have some time for questions. I would love to take any questions that people have. Probably a lot more than you were expecting. Sorry.
I guess I just am sitting here feeling like I don't know where I'm at in the arrested development or what level. I feel like a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I'm trying to figure out for myself right now. So how do I help my kids who are 2 and 4 know the answers to questions that I don't know the answers to?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, do you want to give an example of a tough question? Or I would just say in general, like not all of us are gonna read all the books that I like to read. Not all of us are gonna really devote our professional lives to like diving deep into this. We don't have to, right? If that's your passion, if that's your interest, then you can go deep in a certain area of knowledge and then help share that knowledge with other people. But that's obviously not necessary. What really is necessary is that we can kind of start to see through some of the really problematic and dysfunctional things that are happening. So that's what I would want to highlight. Like things in our educational systems that are not healthy for children, we need to speak up about and try to change as much as we can. Things that are happening in our own relationship to technology and screens, we can control in our families for our children and really be clearer-eyed about that. And if we need to do some reading about that to be more convinced, then we should do that. Because those are the things that we have to control what we can control. So start small. Start with that first step that you can take. I mean, I think right now, actually, screens and being engaged in the political process and being engaged in your children's education are like 3 ways that we all need to be engaged, right? We need to be supporting more complex thinkers as our political leaders. We need to be supporting more complex thinking in our school systems. And we need to be more present and human with our children and not falling into mindless traps. And I've had to come to terms with that myself. Like, I was a late adapter to even having a cell phone, and I have really limited screen time for my daughter. But I have found myself that I'm kind of becoming addicted to my phone. You know, it's like even I'm using it too much. And it's so hard, you know. And again, it's like, it's from empathy. It's like, I get it. It's not easy, but we got to try. We got to try. Just sober up. Sober up, man up. Grow up, show up, step up, clean up. Yeah.
We let our kids watch a half hour of TV a day.
Mm.
They wanted to watch Power Rangers, and it's just great. A couple years ago, my son said, "Why did you let us watch that?"
Yeah. Why did you?
So bad.
I'm really just curious.
They really wanted.
Because they wanted
like,
to.
You know, we limited it very
Yeah.
carefully, and they enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much easier to cook dinner when they're watching TV.
Yeah, it is, but again, it's just how aware are we of our moment-to-moment experience? I mean, how really conscious are we of what we're doing is the ultimate question. I mean, there's lots of things that your children might have wanted to do that you wouldn't let them do because that's your job. And you would take that stand and you would say, yeah, I know you want to eat chocolate cake for dinner every night, and I know you don't want to go to bed, and I know you don't want to brush your teeth. There's certain things you have to do, and I know you want the iPad, and it's like the thing is once it becomes a norm, then it's really hard like to get out of that, right? It's definitely a lot easier just to never expose your children to screens like that. My daughter doesn't really know what she's missing, even though there's always been songs and movies that her friends somehow know all the words to. Guess what? She learns the words from them and then sings along just like they do. But I feel like her overall experience of just being a human being on the planet has been greatly improved by her lack of FaceTime with screens. I do. I can see it.
I appreciate, you know, with my grandchildren, I think we're going to have some of these discussions. So I appreciate you telling me this, so I can go tell my daughter. Right?
Yeah,
No iPad. So, thank you.
I highly recommend, for adults, I highly recommend the book The Shallows. It's a good look at understanding what's going on in the brain when you're online versus reading. And then there's some other books that are more connected really to kids, like The Big Disconnect, Failure to Connect. All these texts are kind of good related to literacy and technology, and there's so many others. So yeah, I mean, and that, you know, for some people, maybe they're open to reading a book. Others, you know, they're not. They're going to be offended by the suggestion, and that's, you know, we all have to try to meet people where they're at somehow. But we also, we can't be so afraid of conflict that we just don't have more meaningful conversations with people, right?
On that, I feel like technology, especially with children, you know, given the iPad when they're bored, is the norm. So if you're the parent that doesn't allow them to have an iPhone or an iPad or watch TV, then you're the social outcast today.
Yeah.
Is it our job, people that understand this intuitively, that these screens are not good for our kids, is it our job to confront other parents that are
that's a tough one. I would
house
say
guests
not
who come
probably.
and they give their kids
Yeah.
the iPad, and of course
Yeah.
my kids are like looking over
To
their
the
shoulders.
extent that they're going to be receptive and maybe have an improvement in their life, then maybe you have a moral obligation to do that. And to the extent that it's not going to be helpful and it's just going to damage that relationship and it's not really going to be any benefit to them because they're not going to change their behavior, then you probably have a sort of strategic impetus to not do that, right? I don't
not
know.
asking you how to navigate
Yeah,
my
no,
friends
it's
or
just
my
that's
family, it's
that's
just,
the reality.
I just
I mean,
feel
it's
like
tough.
The lack of screens
It's
is
tough. It
it's
is.
everywhere.
It is. So it's like, are we going to be conventional or post-conventional? You know? I mean, we all have to stand. It's always like every society is filled with people who most of what they think and believe is just influenced by the stories and beliefs that they have acquired through their social group or family. And it's hard to actually grow out of that. I mean, some of us do at different points in our life. And throughout history, there's always been people who kind of push the boundaries, question the things that are assumed as true. In some cases, we've been helped by things like microscopes and telescopes to like, oh, wait, like this is true, so now I have to change my story about the world. But for most of us, it's not some sort of scientific breakthrough. It's just an actual natural cognitive maturation where we start to question some of the things that we used to believe. We start to actually see with clarity, like, oh, wait, like this context where this is normal, that doesn't feel normal anymore. That feels a little bit off to me now. Like you're tuning into a different frequency, and you owe it to yourself to honor that intuition if you're the one sensing into that of like, everyone's on their screens and they're like mindless zombies, and I don't want to be in that. Don't be in that. Stand in your awareness and cultivate your own awareness and be on a different path, and teach your children how to be on that path. And as our children grow up into adolescence, I mean, that's a big part of what we need to teach them, how to not be conventional sheep, right? In so many ways. Like we have to teach our children to be themselves, to stand up for what they believe in, and to transmit our values to them that are at a different frequency than what they're going to be getting from their social group. Like that is one of the main responsibilities of parents, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it's not easy.
It's
not easy.
Yeah. It's also to inform, so I can control the environment almost 95%.
Yeah.
When they're
enjoy it.
When they're teenagers and all their parents have phones, you don't want to be the one person whose kid doesn't have a phone because then the social outcast, which is it helps to have a social group that's resonant. It helps to find families that resonate. I mean, at the school that I work at, we're kind of gently sort of pushing a wait till 8 notion of like at least wait till 8th grade to get a cell phone. I think I'll probably make my daughter wait a lot longer than that. And I'm okay with her being upset about that because that's my prerogative as a parent. When you say wait till 8, I thought you meant 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, and my daughter's 9, and I'm starting to see the changes already in terms of influence from the social group. But it's part of our job to hold our kids close. Like it's our responsibility, and we can't abdicate that responsibility to people who are the same age as our child who have grown up in unhealthy environments for the most, or even if they've been healthy and loving environments, that's still not who we want to be. We don't want to hand over the responsibility to their peer group. Like there's actually there's a good book called Hold On to Your Kids, which is written by a great psychologist, Gabor Mate, and also a co-author there. Please. It just kind of gets at that point that I'm trying to make, that we have to own that as parents, especially while they're young. Like, enjoy it and take advantage of the huge influence that you're having on your children, because it'll start to get away from you. Once it'll start to get away from you, and then it starts going down a path. And we're all one thing that's interesting about complex systems is there's this notion of like path dependence. So it's like once a trajectory starts, once someone gets on a path, then it's harder to get off that path, right? So the initial steps, the initial grooves that are laid down for children to walk on are really important, right? Which is why early childhood is so important. The grooves and the norms for our kids, like what's normal for them in their first 3 years of life, it sets really deep grooves that they're going to grow into and out of. But it's hard to just totally jump track, right? It's just hard. Mm-hmm.
One question we were talking about, like setting like a situation where the kid feels like they're succeeding, like they're being successful at things. Like my kids, I know sometimes I think with the 4-year-old, she does stuff that maybe I like am guilty of expecting the 2-year-old to like keep up with us a little bit too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how to sometimes let her be at her level and the 4-year-old be at her level, and me like try to not want them to be at my level.
Yeah.
All at the same time.
Yeah, that's got to be hard. And as a father of only one, I can only imagine the exponential challenges that arise with having more than one. But I mean, again, I think the answers are ultimately really simple, right? I mean, patience, empathy, seeing, like catching yourself when you're doing that. Like there's so many things that for me, if I get frustrated about something or angry about something, it's just all about decreasing the time that it takes me to catch myself, check myself, and then reconnect. So there's a basic principle with children which maybe I'm going in a different direction than what you were thinking. But when we cross the line, when we get frustrated or upset, or we do the wrong thing as a parent, or when our child is upset, so like say your younger daughter or your older daughter is frustrated by that dynamic themselves and they're having a big emotional reaction, like it's hard for us not to be triggered by that, which just proves how emotional and related we are. We're all so connected. Our kids trigger us, right? And we trigger them. We're all tuned in. So we have to take responsibility for that attunement and regulate our state, right? And that not even our thinking or anything or idea, just our state. Like, is our state calm and present and peaceful? And no amount of words or logic or explanation are going to have any positive impact until the child is in a positive state again. That's another thing that we could have gone on a whole tangent about that related to education, is just the relationship between like maintaining different states of like well-being, and then how that relates to how available you are for learning, and like how open you are to like new, how vulnerable you are to take risks and to absorb new information, is totally connected to the degree of fear, anxiety, upset, anger you have on one hand versus like openness, loving kindness, like happiness. Like if you're in a positive state, you can hear words, you can process them. I can understand what Dad's saying when I'm happy. When I'm upset, couldn't care less what he's saying, you know, because he's not tuning in with me on that emotional level. And that's really just speaking for myself. Like the thing that I have most painfully learned as a parent is state matters more than logic, right? State is primary, and kids are just in an emotional state all the time, in one way or the other. And the more we can tune with that, then the more we can work with whatever the situation is. If we're tuned in emotionally, like the answer will more likely emerge than if we're having some sort of reaction or frustration or like, or if they're like that too, which is a lot of the time. I mean, it's not easy, right? And that part of that too is like this whole mentality that, oh, kids are just supposed to learn and then study and then get grades, and like, it's almost like we want to just deny and repress what an emotional world we live in, right? Like it's primarily like our relational, emotional, subjective experience, like to be a human being. And we're in so many ways, like in our heads, living in a world that's disconnected from that, right? And we need to find a way to like reintegrate our whole body mind in the way that we process ideas and emotions. And that's what our school should be helping kids to learn how to do, right? More meditation, less regurgitation, right? Thank you all so much for your time. I don't want to keep you any longer. That was probably longer and more intense than you were expecting. So I appreciate you persevering. And I'm happy to stay and talk with anybody who wants to. But thank you.